So the one thing that makes Five Nights at Freddy's unique and really sets it apart from most other games of its time is arguably its deep obscure lore with roots in lost media and creepypasta territory which internet culture has brought in the last decade. And it is that obscure morbidity that has helped it to prolong its life and carve it a successful franchise climbing from indie game to mainstream multi-platform hit. It layers in the lore, using Easter eggs and hidden messages, even hiding lore details in the source code of the website of its creator. However, over the years, much of this lore, which being subjective in its nature, is interpreted by the viewer in various ways that can lead to conflict within the fandom over the validity of individual theories. So that's why I'm here. Please bear in mind that this is my personal take on the lore, and so I'm not invalidating anyone else's theories or versions of the events that are depicted in the games. Having watched the franchise since its inception, I've observed it evolve and believe that is one point that is key to understanding the lore. The lore evolves. As such, to analyse it, we need to start at the beginning and travel along the timeline of releases in the franchise, adding the new data as we go, similar to the infamous Pixar theory. Everything has its place and all the pieces fit together. It's just a matter of figuring it all out. So without further ado, let's start where it all began. So in the first installment in the series, we see a night security guard taking a job at an animatronic themed pizzeria, similar to real-world Chuck E. Cheese, where the robots are less than friendly after dark. The game takes us through 5 nights, and on the 5th night, we see our payslip, which reveals the date as the 12th of November. However, the year is not revealed. Using the pay rate sleuthing from Game Theory's MapPat, it is believed on the rate of pay that the year the game takes place in is 1993, giving us our first date on the timeline. Notably, dialogue in-game may point to this being accurate, as the phone guy who leaves messages for the player each night uses the term flip side, which was commonly used in the 90s at the height of the popularity of pop cassettes. The payslip also reveals to us that our player's character is named Mike Schmidt. Receiving his instructions from pre-recorded tapes each night, Mike is given details on survival methods as well as hints at past events to occur in the franchise of the pizzeria. It becomes clear very quickly from available evidence that the company running the place is more than aware of the bizarre, murderous intent of their robots, but are not particularly concerned about employee welfare, and have even adapted to be able to cover themselves for liability. The job advert we see at the start of the game states the company is not responsible for dismemberment or injury. The fact that they have to state this outright in an advert seems less than promising about the pizzeria's history of treatment to their staff. We would see this continued in the tapes left by the mysterious phone guy, who would win Corporate Downplayer of the Year for his performances we are about to see. On Mike's first night, we learn Phone Guy was the previous night guard, and has created these tapes to aid his successors. It is noted that company policy states that they are not responsible for damage to person or property, and any missing person reports will only be filed after 90 days to allow time to deep clean or replace the flooring.
Introductory greeting from the company that I'm supposed to read. It's kind of a legal thing, you know. Welcome to Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, a magical place for kids and grown-ups alike, where fantasy and fun come to life. Fazbear Entertainment is not responsible for damage to property or person. Upon discovering that damage or death has occurred, a missing person report will be filed within 90 days or as soon as property and premises have been thoroughly cleaned and bleached and the carpets have been replaced. Blah, blah, blah. Now, that might sound bad, I know, but there's really nothing to worry about.
Phone Guy rather passively dismisses this, like it's not a massive red flag if the help wanted ad wasn't bad enough. We would go on to try to persuade the listener that the suits are merely faulty from old age, stating that they have been singing the same songs for 20 years and noting it as an excuse that somewhat gives them permission to be agitated, despite, being supposedly non-living objects.
The animatronic characters here do get a bit quirky at night, but do I blame them? No. If I were forced to sing those same stupid songs for 20 years and I never got a bath, I'd probably be a bit irritable at night too. So remember, these characters hold a special place in the hearts of children, and we need to show them a little respect, right? Okay.
Notice he refers to them as quirky, which is interesting given what we find out later they are capable of is a little more than quirky. We also get introduced to the infamous fandom-breaking event known as the Bite of 87, which we learn was a defining event that led to the animatronics being prevented from actively roaming during the day and forcing them to be allowed to roam at night in an effort to prevent their systems from seizing up.
Just be aware, the characters do tend to wander a bit. They're left in some kind of free roaming mode at night. Something about their servos locking up if they get turned off for too long. They used to be allowed to walk around during the day too, but then there was the Bite of 87. Yeah, it's amazing that the human body can live without the frontal lobe.
The implications given by Fungi is that someone was bitten by an animatronic and as a result they lost the frontal lobe of their brain. The wording does oddly seem to imply that the victim actually survives the encounter. An interesting detail found in the game also shows that in the custom night, if the settings are set to the display reading 1987, the game will crash after receiving a jump scare from the mysterious Golden Freddy character, implying that in some way the character may have a connection to the event. It is also revealed that the suit's murderous nature is believed to be based on a programming issue, and that they see the night guard, and presumably any human, as a robotic endoskeleton that is missing its character suit shell. As this is stated to be against the rules, most likely based on real-world attraction characters not being allowed to break the illusion by revealing they are in fact not the real character, it is believed the robots try to fix this by stuffing people into the suits.
Your safety, the only real risk to you as a night watchman here, if any, is the fact that these characters, if they happen to see you after hours, probably won't recognize you as a person. They'll most likely see you as a metal endoskeleton without its costume on. Now, since that's against the rules here at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, they'll probably try to forcefully stuff you inside a Freddy Fazbear suit.
This is, however, revealed by the gameplay to be a flat-out lie by the company in an attempt to rationalise the behaviour. As we see when Bonnie enters the parts and search room, he does not attempt to stuff the bare endoskeleton in the room into a suit, which would imply that the suits have another reason for that specific behaviour. The fact that Fungi describes the specifics of the suit stuffing seems to imply that he has witnessed it before in some regard, as this description of how the victim's eyes would pop out the front of the mask seems more like a recollection than a mere hypothesis.
Now that wouldn't be so bad if the suits themselves weren't filled with crossbeams, wired, and animatronic devices, especially around the facial area. So you can imagine how having your head forcibly pressed inside one of those could cause a bit of discomfort and death. The only parts of you that would likely see the light of day again would be your eyeballs and teeth that pop out the front of the mask.
The game over screen also does seem to imply that this is indeed exactly what would happen to the victim in this situation. This does raise the question though of how often does this type of death actually occur? If the animatronics did this to every person they came across at night, it would be most likely very newsworthy if every guard employed disappeared on site when the deaths are covered up. Phone Guy mentions in Night 3 most people don't make it that far, but his tone does sound genuine when he states that it's not because they died.
You're doing great. Most people don't last this long. I mean, you know, they usually move on to other things by now. I'm not implying that they died. That's not what I meant.
It does make sense, based on the Help Wanted ad and Night 1 tape, that any sane applicant would very quickly give up this job after presumably the first night, even before the animatronics came knocking. The tone of the Night 2 tape even seems to verify this point, as it does sound like genuine surprise that the listener returned for a second night. So I believe we can infer that at least one suit stuffing murder has been implied to have occurred, based on the evidence, at some point prior to these tapes being recorded. Phone Guy would go on to ponder the idea that playing dead would fool the animatronics before backtracking, when he considers that they might then believe the victim to be a costume without an endoskeleton.
I had an idea. If you happen to get caught and want to avoid getting stuffed into a Freddy suit, try playing dead. You know, go limp. Then there's a chance that maybe they'll think that you're an empty costume instead. Then again, if they think you're an empty costume, they might try to stuff a mental skeleton into you. I wonder how that would work. Yeah, never mind. Scratch that. It's best just not to get caught.
While this will be retroactively used in future games, it is clearly implied to be Phone Guy merely hypothesizing strategies for survival, and so at most it's just a very dark joke at this point in the timeline. As the game progresses, we learn that Phone Guy is indeed pre-recording the tapes all on the same night, which would ultimately lead to his demise. The fact the tapes appear to automatically play through the phone implies the company may not actually be aware of their existence, as they are seen to contain somewhat damning evidence as we hear the actual death of an employee.
Oh, hello. Hey, wow, day 4. I knew you could do it. Hey, listen, I may not be around to send you a message tomorrow. It's been a bad night here for me. I'm kind of glad that I recorded my messages for you when I did. Hey, do me a favor. Maybe sometime you can check inside those suits in the back room. I'm going to try to hold out until someone checks. Maybe it won't be so bad. Yeah, I always wondered what was in all those empty heads back there. You know. Oh no.
The pre-recorded nature of the tapes raises the question of when exactly Phone Guy's death does occur. The fact they play automatically does show they could have played for multiple people before Mike has taken the job, which would seem to be supported by the fact that he expresses his intent to cling to life in the back room until he is found. Yet we know the company policy is clearly to remove all evidence and wait at least 90 days before reporting, so it is very likely that Phone Guy is indeed long dead. So what we have covered so far raises an interesting question. Why would Mike stay for a full 7 nights at this nightmare of a job unless he had some very specific personal reason for doing so? We discover after the custom night that Mike is now being fired for odour and tampering with the suits. It does seem that the odour is meant to be a somewhat meta reference to the fact that the game is meant to be so terrifying, and that the odour is implied to be, you know, Mike being pretty terrified. Mike's personal stake in the pizzeria does appear to be tied to a specific individual, Golden Freddy. What do we notice so far about this golden bear? Phone Guy has not once mentioned it in his calls, despite it being a rather formidable threat, and it simply appears in the office implying it is not merely an animatronic. We also see scattered instances of texts reading "It's me" associated with the appearance of Golden Freddy, which implies in some way he is attempting to get Mike to recognise him, so there must be some form of familiarity between them. Oddly, Golden Freddy is also shown to be in a slumped position, possibly lacking the endoskeleton which holds up the robot's suits. Mike's connection to Golden Freddy may be tied to past events we hear of at the pizzeria, which we see in the form of posters in the right hallway which changed into news clippings to give us lore, providing historical events surrounding the franchise. On the 26th of June, in unspecified year, it is stated that two kids were lured into a back room at Freddy's by someone and weren't seen again. The culprit was noted to be identified by security video and arrested the following day. Sometime later, 5 kids are linked to the incident, and it is unveiled the culprit was dressed in a mascot costume and has now been charged. The company is notably suffering a lack of business due to this event. The pizzeria also would be hit with sanitation threats by the health department when the suits would begin to emit foul odours and leak fluids, being seen by some as reanimated carcasses. Years after the incident, the CEO of Freddy's would announce its closure after a year-long search for buyers. However, no one would purchase the pizzeria due to its dark reputation. In his statements, he declares, "These characters will live on in the hearts of kids. These characters will live on." Now this seems to be an almost ironic hint at the true nature of these animatronics that we see in the franchise. The kids mentioned in the incident live on in the characters, rather than the characters living on in the kids. Notably, they live on in characters, which would explain why other objects bear the image of the characters appearing to be possessed. The posters in the hall featuring the suits changing to crying kids, and the spare heads in parts and services are able to move. The Night 5 tape is believed to give the defining proof by some of this idea, as despite initially sounding like a mere demonic screeching, the tape contains a hidden message. It is reported that by reversing and altering the tape audio, it reveals an excerpt from a text known as an autobiography of a yogi, which is meant to detail the concept of granting souls to inanimate objects. So, rounding up the summary of the lore that we have from the first game, we have Mike Schmidt taking a job in November of what we believe was 1993 at Freddy's Pizzeria, which houses a Freddy, Bonnie, Chica and Foxy. Golden Freddy appears as an apparition, but we don't know if the actual suit is present. We learn that an animatronic bit someone in 1987, the victim possibly suffering severe brain damage, and Golden Freddy may have been involved. This led to the suits being set to night roaming from then on out. On 26th of June, in an unspecified year, 5 kids were lured into a room by a man in a costume. Presumably, he killed them and hid them in the suits that began to smell and leak fluids. The company would lose business and would resort to covering up deaths when the now possessed suits begin murdering people. Eventually, they are forced to close and can't find anyone who will buy the facility. At least one person is stuffed into a suit by the animatronics. Folk Guy would later also presumably suffer this fate after recording his tapes prior to November 1993. Mike appears to have a personal connection to Golden Freddy, who also has a connection to the Bite of 87. Foxy is listed as out of order on Pirates Cove, though this is never really explained. The suits appear to have a motive in their killings, as they target Mike, Fog Guy, and presumably the previous suit stuffing victim, and don't stuff the endoskeleton in the back room, despite the belief they stuff people for very specific technical reasons. So that is it for part 1. So see you in part 2, and we will tackle the sequel prequel FNAF 2, which grants us a bit more context into the history of Five Nights at Freddy's.